I'm here tonight to challenge some of the orthodoxy within and around Rails. Can I ask before we start, I presume everyone came tonight it isn't using Postgres, otherwise you wouldn't have a reason to be here, is that right? Or are you all using MySQL? Postgres. Is there anyone here who's using MySQL who first did an evaluation of databases and looked at Postgres in particular and decided to use MySQL instead? One.
Because of scalability. The ability to do multi-master relationships easily in order to scale the database faster.
Okay. Well, if you want, is that the only reason?
Yeah.
All right. Calling this a polemic. So as I see it, the situation is that we pity the poor programmer, slaving away in the bit mines day in and day out. I think much of the reason why SQL databases have been such an amazing success, despite their flaws, is that they remove a major burden from the programmer, right? They let you say, just give me somewhere to put my data and give it back to me, and don't let me worry about the details. So I think a lot of people, particularly in a community like Rails, where the guy who's pushing the software is very big on MySQL, has very strong opinions about not using smart databases and how you're supposed to use a database. It's very easy in a community like this in particular to just pick up MySQL, which is what everyone else is using. Not just within this community, but actually if you want to use an open source database, that's what everybody's using. And honestly, I think that's probably the reason why most people are using MySQL, because that's what everybody's using, and you don't want to have to fuss with, other details. But, so the network effect, I think, is the reason everybody uses MySQL. And it's a valid and important reason to use MySQL. It's easier to get people who know MySQL. There are more MySQL books. Projects you might want to use are probably almost certainly going to work with MySQL. They may not work with other things. So this is a very important reason to use MySQL. So my way of thinking, this is the only reason there is to use MySQL. So in the rest of the presentation, what I'm going to do first of all is a technical comparison of MySQL and its obvious competitor, which in open source databases, which is Postgres. I'm going to talk about not only the technical features, but also some other things that may be important that you haven't considered, particularly concerning the license. And then I'm going to talk about the role of databases with Rails, and in particular, David Hanson's opinion that you shouldn't have smart databases, that those are from the devil. So, features. As I see it, the comparison of the features of Postgres and MySQL looks like this. So the purple part in the middle is just SQL in general. They both do that. If I'm being generous, there's a small sliver at the bottom where MySQL has some features that perhaps that Postgres doesn't. And Postgres has a great many features that MySQL doesn't. So the features that MySQL has. Multiple table types. I don't think this is terribly important, but you can choose to have the database in MySQL store your data in a variety of different formats. It has a log format, for example, if you've got a table that you only ever write to. It has myISAM, although I've never been on a project where people didn't end up converting a whole lot of myISAM tables into something else because they fell apart all the time. But it's an interesting option to have available. You mentioned clustering. MySQL makes a big fuss of clustering. It's built right into the product. It's reasonably easy to set up as for clustering, which is always a headache whenever you try and do it. You can certainly do clustering with Postgres. There's actually a variety of options for doing that, but you would probably be reasonably able to claim that it would be easier with MySQL. That's it. I don't know of any other technical advantage to MySQL over Postgres. Anybody know of anything? Okay. Moving to the other end of things, there are many, many, many reasons to choose Postgres over MySQL in terms of features. One of the most important ones to me is that the query optimizer and the query execution engine in Postgres can use more than one index in a query. I think many people using MySQL don't even know this. MySQL can only use, and I believe still even in the latest release, one index per query. If you're doing any kind of complex SQL, MySQL may well be executing it much, much slower than it otherwise might be able to do. Postgres has better full-text indexing now than MySQL does, and I noticed nobody mentioned that as the reason they were using MySQL. For the longest time, MySQL had text indexing built in, although only still with my ISAM tables. Postgres now has it very nicely built in, and it works very well.
Is that true for 8.3 and 8.2?
I believe they introduced it either in 8.0 or 8.1. So yeah, it's great. For Rails people, the Ruby drive, there's a non-blocking driver for Postgres now, which I haven't had a chance to mess with, but I believe what this means is you don't need as many mongrels, because when a mongrel hits Postgres, while it's waiting for the answer, it can go off and do something else. Can't do that with MySQL. I don't know if you can do that with any of the other databases with Rails, can you?
As of last week, you can't do it with MySQL, and it only reduces the number of mongrels you really need if you're using Edge, which is got relatively fast progression.
As I say, I only just heard about this recently, so I believe it works. You can get it to work pretty well with Postgres now, but
They both of them, as of, like I said, a week, have had support for not being non-blocking.
okay. Well, I'll take that off next time I do this one. If you are tempted to put rules, stored procedures, or triggers in your database, it is orders of magnitude easier to do in Postgres. MySQL has bare bones, SQL standard, stored procedures and triggers, and it's absolutely painful to use. I had a situation where I was storing sequences of words that were keywords in Google Ads and the like. I wanted to store them in alphabetical order, and I thought, well, great, I'll put a trigger in that'll alphabetize the set of words. There's no ability to sort a comma-delimited string or an array or anything in MySQL. On the other hand, Postgres has very advanced capabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Postgres has a genetic query optimizer. If you tend to write complex queries that hit up 7 or 8 tables at a time, you can easily, with MySQL, wind up in a situation where you write a query that takes 30 seconds to optimize and a quarter of a second to execute. Postgres will kick into a mode where it uses a genetic query optimizer that will execute quickly, find a reasonable plan, and hit it up a lot more often than MySQL can. Postgres has some other advanced features, including functional partial indexes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this kind of idea. It sounds very geeky, but if you're really pushing your database, they can be very useful. You can create indexes on not just the fields in your database, but on functions of the fields in your database. So if you want to be able to search on, let's say, the capitalized version of a name, you do that a lot. Rather than having to create a duplicate field where you capitalize it, you just tell it to index the capitalized form of the name, and then whenever you search for that, it'll use the index. You can also tell it to, if you've got a huge table but you nearly only ever work with a certain subset of working set, you can tell it just to index that part, not the whole thing. Smaller index is going to run faster. That can make a significant difference if you're trying to tune a really heavy-duty database to run fast. PostgreSQL isn't 100% Oracle compatible, but they try to make the language and the capabilities fairly compatible with Oracle. So if you're talking to a suit, they may like the idea that it's reasonably easy to convert a lot of Postgres stuff to Oracle. And when I was talking about advanced rules, stored procedures, and triggers, there's one language you can use in MySQL, which is SQL, and it's horrible, as I said. If you want to write code in your database with Postgres, you can use PGSQL, which is their Oracle-like language. You can use TCL if you wanted to do that. If you're Perl, if you're one of those people, you can actually put Perl code right in your database and run it. Python, if you haven't learned about Ruby yet. Java, if you have some of those sort of people on your team. PHP even. You can use R if you've got a project that has any statisticians involved in it. They could get very excited about this one. Nothing like running your statistics right in the database to speed it up. Ruby, Scheme, SH, and there's probably a bunch more, but those are the ones I know about. So you can actually write your triggers in Ruby in Postgres. Okay, but I hear you cry in your relentless search for truth. MySQL is really fast. Everybody knows that MySQL is the fastest open source database, right? So you heard that? I believe it got that reputation because the default install of Postgres for the longest time was for like a 64 megabyte machine. So if you installed it with just the default, it was horribly slow. They fixed that recently. It's very difficult to compare the speed of databases. The only way to do it is to take your application and write it for both databases and compare the speed of the two. But the claim that MySQL is generally faster than Postgres has got to be flat out wrong. I found a website, tweakers.net. They look at tweaking and speeding up and overclocking computers. At one point, they wanted to test the speed of various different multiprocessor offerings that Intel brought out. So what they did was they wrote some synthetic database benchmarks and ran them against MySQL 4, MySQL 5, and Postgres. I like this because they did a remarkably detailed job, but also it seems pretty clear they didn't have a dog in this fight. They didn't really care which database was faster. They weren't setting out to prove anything. They were actually just interested in the speed of these various platforms. Here is just what you get running their benchmark against, one processor, a single processor with 2 cores, and so on. And they certainly found Postgres particularly scaled much better on multiple processors than MySQL did. This was MySQL 5.0 and Postgres 8.2. Both these products have had major releases since then. I don't believe MySQL actually has any significant speed ups, but Postgres has added some features that should actually make it quite a bit faster. Here's what they found when they tried hitting the MySQL database with lots of, from 0 up to 100 simultaneous connections, all keeping the database busy. That's probably about the kind of curve you'd expect to see trying to scale a database with lots of connections to it. But here's what you get with Postgres. Same hardware. Right? I know which one I like the look of if I'm expecting my database to get busy. Here's another benchmark I was able to find. There's an independent organization called spec.org that publishes a whole variety of different benchmarks and then asks people to run them. These were not run on the same hardware, although it looks very similar, but the benchmark results you get are so close that clearly, there isn't a significant difference. So I believe, in my experience, that Postgres does scale better to really heavy lots and lots of simultaneous users, but honestly, there isn't a huge difference in speed. Anyone who claims that MySQL is a really fast database compared to other things is just flat out wrong. For many people, though, I think the most important reason not to use MySQL is its license. Now, there probably aren't many people in this room who are paying MySQL for MySQL, but there may be one or two because of the license. According to the MySQL website, you can either use MySQL under a GPL license or you can get a commercial license. And they say that with the GPL license, if a MySQL-based application is redistributed, notice not MySQL, it's the MySQL-based application. It's redistributed. The complete source code for this application must also be open and available for distribution. So what they want you to do is, if you write an application that is capable of talking to MySQL and you want to use MySQL under a GPL license, they want your application to be GPL'd. Fine, you say, but they can't enforce that on me. Just to make it clear, that's what they say here as well. Here's the problem. The MySQL client libraries use the GPL. So if you pull down Ruby MySQL and you look at the instructions on installing it, you have to download and install the MySQL C client API header files and libraries. So if you're using those libraries under the GPL license, your application has to be under the GPL license. Now, this is fine if you're just doing an application in-house. If you're selling an application for people to install in their businesses, this is an issue for you, I think. And those MySQL licenses, while they're cheaper than Oracle, aren't cheap in my book. On the other hand, this is the entire Postgres license. says you have permission to use, copy, modify. You can make your own compiled version of Postgres, make some changes, and sell it closed source if that's what you wish to do. You can do anything with Postgres that you like. You just have to include this file. That ends the polemic. In my book, there is no technical reason to be using MySQL. Clustering, arguably, perhaps, but there are a variety of ways of doing clustering with Postgres that, to me, is not enough reason to pick MySQL, given the other advantages that Postgres has. Now, the other interesting issue to me with trying to use databases and Rails together is David Heinemeier Hanssen's position on stored procedures and triggers, and what that means for people who are using Rails with databases. Now, David Heinemeier Hanssen wrote Rails, to be fair, to develop Basecamp. It was actually originally part of Basecamp. He pulled it out, right? And I think for the kind of databases, for kind of applications like that, he's right. That's a perfectly reasonable way to work. That's what you might call an application database. It's a database that serves one application. In this case, putting all the code, all the smarts, everything in the single application is simplifying your application. But a lot of people are not in that position. You're working with a database where you're going to be hitting it from more than one application, more than one Rails application, let alone hitting it from other applications, wanting to hit it with, reporting tools, who knows what. In that case, there is a good case to be made for putting some, if not as much as possible, of the model logic into your database, because you're reducing duplication, right? If your picture of the way you develop an application is you put all the smarts on that side, then you have to do those smarts 3 times in this picture. So I think for applications that are a little different to what the 37 Signals is making, you could argue this makes some sense. The other thing is that even if you aren't in that situation, there are some processes that if you put them in the database run much, much faster. Particularly SQL is horrible at handling recursive structures. If you're trying to do a social networking application, which I think there's a rule that says everybody has to do that with Rails, right? Then you're going to be doing things where you're trying to traverse graphs and who are the people who are within 3 friend links of this guy or something. And if you have to do those with individual queries in SQL, you're either writing this monster, long, horrible SQL query or something. You just knock it out in a stored procedure and it will be simpler and much, much faster. The last project I was working on was a pretty big project, and we maintained those with migrations. There's some plugins that can help with that, but it's not beautiful. So if anyone here is doing any of this stuff and has any thoughts about it, I think that would be an interesting thing to discuss. And that's it. Oh.
So, as a Rails developer, day-to-day, what things you run into
Rails itself works great with Postgres. It doesn't help you with things like maintaining stored procedures and triggers or writing them or much of anything. As I say, there are some plugins which I don't remember the name of right now. I probably should have put that with me that try to help with that. But straight up Rails code works great with Postgres. And as I say, if particularly machine-generated queries and things, in some cases will run significantly better under Postgres because it can do things like use more than one index. So even if you're just in that situation where you don't want to put any intelligence in the database and so on, I still think there's a good case to be made for using Postgres. Works great with Rails.
For some of the more advanced features like stored procedures, what's your typical workflow? Are those things you're writing, kind of tracking what you're seeing, or
Yeah, I keep them in the migrations. Try to write tests for them. As I say, I think there probably could be better support for it. in Rails. In fact, I have had in the back of my mind for a while trying to do some things a bit like the way you can get Rails to generate some of your JavaScript for you for sort of more normal cases of triggers. It'd be kind of nice if there was a plugin you could install and then just drop a line in your migration and it would denormalize something for you. Rails doesn't help, but it doesn't really get in the way, other than testing sometimes can be a bit curly. And that, I guess, can interfere a little with testing. It can make other tests harder to run. You might need to, in fact, last place I was working, we had sort of ran two sets of tests in two modes, one of them where we dropped all the triggers, stored procedures, and one where we ran with them. So that was a kind of customized testing thing, which then created more problems when we wanted to install other things into the test environment. So,
You said you could do it in Postgres. What do you use to do it?
I haven't done it. I have to be honest, I haven't done it. I did work with log shipping as a way of doing having a failover system, and that once you got it set up and worked quite well. And I just saw somebody release some code recently that tries to reduce the amount of traffic involved in doing that. There are a variety of different ways of doing it. They tend to be based on a library of triggers that you install in Sloaney, you may have heard of. I believe they work just fine. They work, once you get them set up, they're a little more work to set up. The Postgres people know that this is something that their users want, and they have it online to be like the main feature they're working on for Postgres 9, which is expected to be out next year. And one other thing about the Postgres project, it's rugged. I mean, I've worked in places where we've had huge databases in MySQL, and we're always getting table corruption, particularly with my ISAM, but not just that. I've hardly ever had to rebuild a table in Postgres that wasn't down to some kind of hardware failure. I've also had great success migrating between versions of Postgres. The initial release of a new version of Postgres is generally rock solid. I don't know how those guys do it, but it's very good code. So.
Two questions. First, do you know, because I'm just not familiar enough with it, if a lot of the functions in MySQL for arithmetic and date time modifications, I don't know if those are SQL standards or maybe some are, but others are just put in by MySQL. And secondly, what your experience is with Postgres and its functions. Because personally, I feel the MySQL ones are sometimes clumsy and not very intuitive.
Yeah, Postgres generally has a better library of such things. But the other thing is you can write your own in Ruby or whatever is your favorite programming language. You can define new data types in the database, which depending on your domain might be a useful thing to do. I mean, it's just in every way, a much more flexible beast to work with than MySQL.
Can you load in those new functions while the database is running, or do you have to shut down the process?
You sort of define them into that. You execute a piece of code that defines them, and it's basically stored into the database at that point. You can shut it down, bring it back up, and they should still be there. It's great.
What's been your experience migrating existing projects from MySQL to Postgres?
Yeah, it's horrible. If you're all Rails code, and there's not a lot of custom SQL involved, probably okay, but even converting the data, I haven't actually found a really good tool for converting the data. There are scripts out there that claim to do it, but I've never got them to work properly. I generally wind up writing some custom thing or doing a dump from MySQL and just trying to fix that error on the global replace, try to load it. It's horrible.
So you can just on the data side try to move a
yeah.
production application from one to the other is not.
Right, there's other things like MySQL doesn't have a Boolean data type. So if you come across a field that's, a small int, is that a Boolean or not? Right? You want to make it a Boolean field in Postgres. So, an automated tool pretty much has to do a query on that whole table, that field, every value in that field. Is it only 0 or 1? Not great. I honestly would advise you, if you're not using stored procedures or triggers or anything really curly, it might be worth doing, but it might not. But if you're doing any custom SQL or anything like that, it's probably not worth changing. But the next project. Anybody else got any? Yes.
Yes, so I'm relatively new to Postgres. So let's say if the copy of database is corrupted, is there like better way to write a rel test to test if the Postgres database is corrupted?
You want a way to determine if the Postgres database? Yeah, there are some check tools, repair tools that Postgres comes with that are similar to the kinds of things that you get with MySQL or something else. I don't off the top of my head remember what they are, but there's a check table, repair table kind of stuff. I've had to do it very, very rarely, which is the other thing. Yeah.
When you say clustering, are you talking about like replication from a master to a bunch of slaves?
Yeah, generally.
And that you want better in Postgres?
No, as I say, I haven't done it.
Oh, okay.
I would say it's probably easier in MySQL. You can certainly do it in Postgres and set it up so it ends up working as well as clustering ever works. It's always a source of problem for anyone who ever does it with anything. I don't think it's enough reason to use MySQL, but I guess if clustering was the only thing you cared about, maybe it is. To me, we're all using Rails because we like to use the best possible tool. And there isn't any way on earth to argue that MySQL is a better tool than Postgres. Okay?
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.